Well, we want to welcome everyone back again for another series in our study of the church and politics, and this is part 2 in our discussion of the issue of abortion. We want to encourage you, if you haven't already watched the previous live stream that we did last week. I thought, Danny, that was fantastic.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I highly recommend that you go to that. But we are really excited today to continue this conversation, and we're going to really challenge and stretch you, I think, in a lot of ways by bringing on a special guest, a friend of ours, Mako Nagasawa. Mako, welcome. Mako grew up in Cerritos, California, went to Stanford. I tried to go to Stanford, but they let me visit the campus, but I didn't quite get into the school. But he studied in industrial engineering and public policy with a focus on education. He worked at Intel Corporation for 6 years while serving a Spanish-speaking ministry to Mexican immigrants in Palo Alto, California. He married Ming in May of 1999 and moved to Boston, Massachusetts. He then worked for 2 startup companies trying to bring technology and jobs to inner-city communities. Since 2000, Mako, Ming, and their 2 children, John and Zoe, have lived among friends in a Christian intentional community house in a black and brown neighborhood in Dorchester, Massachusetts, where I told Mako my mom graduated from Dorchester High School. So Mako did campus ministry with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship from 2001 to 2014, and he founded the Anastasis Center in 2014, which was then called the New Humanity Institute. They worship at a neighborhood church in Dorchester, where Mako serves as on the elder team. He earned a Master's of Theological Studies from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary in May of 2019. In addition to Christian ethics and theology, biblical studies, and early church history, Mako enjoys photography, food, tea, and stories from around the world, and he misses the Pacific Ocean. I like that, Mako. Welcome, Mako.
Thank you. I miss it desperately. So
I was just in Laguna Hills yesterday, by the way. So
I'll be in El Segundo on the beach this weekend at the Manhattan Beach Beach Volleyball Open.
I don't think we're helping him at all right now, by the way, Danny. I think we're making his pain worse. But Mako, just start us a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about the Anastasis Center, which, by the way, I'll give a quick plug here. The Anastasis Center. You can get lost for days on this website because of the wealth of information. It's fantastic. So,
well, thank you so much. And Danny and I almost knew each other at Peninsula Bible Church in Northern California there. And what a treat, because I've read some of Danny's sermons, and Rob, I've appreciated your work and podcasting, especially also on Christian ethics. So the Anastasis Center is right now we're a small team of people. We focus on making early Christian restorative justice and healing atonement very practical and understandable. So we're always iterating through that. One of our hopes at some point is to create a curriculum for youth, but we're not there yet. So I would say Christian restorative justice is contrasted with retributive justice, like the idea that God's justice is retributive. God just wants to get payback, right, for wrongs that are done against him or others. Restorative justice is a view that in situations where there is wrong done, the offender is called into partnership to participate in undoing the harm that he or she has done. Now, what happens if the person does not want to partner in that or does not, in Christian parlance, does not want to repent? That's a great question. I think God's justice is still restorative, and in that case, it's still a kind of like, it becomes like an addiction treatment center for addicts who don't want to give up the addiction, right? God says, Jesus is your healing, and the person says, I don't want to be healed. So I don't agree that that's a problem, right? I mean, that's the issue. And so it connects with the idea that Jesus has taken up our fallen human nature in order to give us his healed human nature.
Interesting.
So that's at the core. We rely on Irenaeus, Athanasius, the Cappadocians. We make this relevant in evangelism tools, Bible studies, and Christian ethics curricula. So at some point, I would love to talk with you guys more about all that.
Okay. Yeah. That sounds great.
You know, for those who might, the names he threw out there just a few minutes ago, for those who might not know, are some of the early church fathers in the early centuries of the church who did extensive work in Christian ethics and these kinds of things, and sometimes get ignored by us in the current situation. So it's good that you got the roots in the history of the church. So I think that's very helpful.
And Danny, really quickly, and anastasis is the Greek word for resurrection, right? Right, Mako? I'm assuming that's where you got the name from.
Yes, that is right.
Okay.
You know, a few years ago, you published this book, Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics in the U.S. By the way, it's a
Yeah.
fantastic book. It's exhausting and exhaustive because there's just so much great information in there. And as the own description, your description, this book incorporates biblical studies, church history, science, social science history, and public policy to argue that we must not approach abortion policy primarily from a criminal justice standpoint, as modern conservatives do, but from a broad social and economic standpoint meant to benefit and bless all children. So your website is just full, as Rob mentioned, all kinds of content. I know this is kind of an open-ended question that could go on for days, but what would you summarize? What are some of the key points that you think everyone, especially those of us in the pro-life camp, should know or be aware of?
Oh my goodness. Well, I've tried to distill the book down, and thank you so much. I'm really honored that you have read it, and to be in a community where we're discussing some of these things, which have been discussed by other folks in other ways. I just tried to tie it all together. I've tried to distill it down to 3 major points. I make a pro-contraception argument from scripture and science. So I know that's going to hurt some of my Catholic friends, and but it depends on what we think about the variation in biblical manuscripts, because there are 2 different manuscript families. They don't agree about what is the fetus and what's going on there. And then the early church looked to 2 different sources of science, and that continued. That had an impact on us through England and American law. And so it's fascinating to look at that. But essentially, I come out with a pro-contraception argument. I come out with a pro-economic justice argument that compares Catholics in the 1930s watched the Great Depression happen and the abortion rate spiked because, of course, if you don't have hope, you're not sure you want to bring children into the world.
Yeah, right.
So they developed a pro-life kind of argument that was connected to economic justice and an anti-poverty position, a democracy of small businesses and labor protections and financial protections and all these things. So, that really changed when, well, dare I say, white evangelicals joined the Reagan coalition and decided to bring the anti-abortion position in connection with dismantling the New Deal and dismantling the role that the federal government can play in helping make public investments in everyone. So they thought abortion happens because people aren't trusting God, and so it's atheist. And guess what? Who organizes the atheists? It's the communists. Aha! We're going to jump on board with Reagan's critique of communism and Cold War posture against the Soviet Union. And in spite of the fact that 60 to 70% of all women who procured abortions at the time were Catholic and Protestant. But sure, it's the result of atheism. I mean, but then what that does is it really penalizes women and then the children who are born into poverty. It takes away social supports and all these things. So we know that taking a pro-economic justice framing and social welfare framing is going to be more effective. And yet there's an ideology at play from Ronald Reagan. And then the third is a pro-woman argument against retributive Christian nationalism, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about, but because I think we might have differences in subtle ways about what exactly we would do from a policy standpoint, but I think we share the goal of bringing the abortion rate down. There are some who don't actually share that goal.
Oh, interesting.
There are some who say, I hear your social science arguments, but I would rather just criminalize it because God will judge us if we don't. And that's the Christian nationalist position. And if you go in that direction, then you actually don't care that much about what it does to the abortion rate, because the Christian nationalists are fine with just punishing people. So it's not about bringing the abortion rate down.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. Interesting. Now, Danny and I both affirm, if I can say this, Danny, for you, and you can challenge me if you wish, a pro-life position, whatever that might mean to some extent. But there are some concerns that I've had, growing concerns over the course of time, One is that the fact that the issue is just really complex, and I think boiling it down to an either or is a problem because the issue is just immensely complex. And I think now that we post Dobbs, with states making certain laws and about whatever, that there are some states that have laws that actually there are good things that need to be done that are now illegal. And I'll tell a story in a future episode about my wife and I had a 20-year-old child in the womb that died, and we had to have a procedure
20
weeks. Yeah, thank you. A child of 20 weeks that now we had to have a procedure to have that child removed that would actually be illegal in some states. My wife would have to carry a dead child until full term. It just doesn't make any sense. But another problem is that the pro-life position really has this that you mentioned, that it criminalizes abortion. Hey, it's illegal. It's murder. This is a problem. And Danny and I will do a future live stream, probably, hopefully, on the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. This is not a good way to solve the problem. I think it just creates more problems there. So maybe if we just step back, I said a lot there. You can begin by talking about what kind of people have abortions and some of the complexities of the issues, and then if you want to address further some of the things I just brought up.
Sure. Well, I know Jenna, your past guest, talked about the role of just personal finances or economic conditions in it. Women in poverty have the vast majority or the plurality of abortions. So women at the poverty level, or poverty line or below, have 3 times the abortion rate of women not in poverty. They procured 42.4% of all abortions. Wow. I believe the last data that I have was maybe 2019, 2020. But in general, as Jenna mentioned, and I know you talked about before, in the U.S., women who are already mothers procure 60% of all abortions.
It is 60%. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Half have 2 or more children.
Wow.
And so it's not that they're trying to avoid being a parent, it's that they're trying to care for the children they already have.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you think about life from a perspective of a poor woman, this gets really significant because, number one, it just costs more to be a woman in the US. I mean, professional clothing, dry cleaning, personal appearance. All these things that we as men, we can wear the same suit a few times a week, right? And we just change our shirt and tie. But look, a woman in the professional classes, that's for better and for mostly worse, right? That is frowned upon. So it just costs more to be a woman. And then we put it on women to buy their own birth control and all these things. Now, when you're a poor woman, you're usually trying to deal with a lot of complex financial, family and financial issues to begin with, and sometimes living with a boyfriend might help financially. It might make a woman feel more protected in her community or in her circles. So then she gets pregnant, and that's kind of understandable, given her choices. And so we have to think about that. And it's really significant that we look then internationally. Because the abortion rates in other countries, regardless of income level, or just when we aggregate them by nation, actually stay remarkably consistent no matter what the laws are.
Oh, okay.
And so someone has to make a really good case that, which doesn't exist from the data, that suddenly criminalizing abortion in the U.S., given the way that's tends to come from a right-wing package of laissez-faire capitalism, and let's strip out social welfare. Let's make you, deal with a school system that no longer cares that much for special needs and special ed. All of that, like, how does that make sense? Now, married women in the U.S. make up 14 to 15% of all abortions, but even that, I think, is underreported, and it underestimates the number of women who might hope to marry the man that she, had conceived a child with, at least at first, right? And then for whatever reason, something happens, she changes her mind, or it's not a good time for them. So in other words, I think that, what we might think of as out of wedlock abortion, it is an expression of hope, of hope. And it's also been shown that men are less likely to propose to their girlfriends if they live in the Rust Belt and their jobs have been shipped overseas, right?
What's the Rust Belt?
The industrial Midwest.
Okay, thank you. All right.
So kind of the Michigan, Illinois, where
Okay.
the automotive industry used to be centered.
Okay. All right.
Pennsylvania, where all the heavy U.S. industry that's been put overseas. Most of those jobs have gone overseas, or many of them have.
Right, exactly, and so it highlights the role of economics and people's livelihoods. I mean, are men less confident about, offering a stable partnership to the woman that he may love, if he doesn't have a good job at hand or doesn't feel confident about it? Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. And so I think when we ask the question of who's getting abortions and why, we really need to pay attention to all this stuff. It's as if, and I don't go so far as to say it is this, but it's as if people in the public, right? Like, they're not necessarily following Jesus, but just in a public sense, they want to feel human. And so they're going to get into relationships and they're going to have sex. And what if the role of government policy, including abortion policy, but a whole bunch of other policies, really just shapes the conditions for if they feel confident to get married and to bring children into the world? What if that is the role of policy? That's a totally different framework than thinking about criminal justice penalties for, like, well, maybe a woman and maybe the doctor should bear the cost of having abortions. Like, well, let's really look at that.
Yeah, it's like Rob gets tired of me saying sometimes. One of my standard answers on all these things are, well, it's complicated. And that's sort of my tagline for so many of these discussions. It is complicated. And now, Roz, as you mentioned earlier to you, that he's done a series of live streams on the nature of the kingdom and poverty, particularly how the nature of the kingdom and taking care of the poor. And you've already sort of gone there a little bit in your previous answer, but is there any specific things related to poverty alleviation as it's connected to abortion? Some specific things that you've thought through that would help reduce the number of abortions? That's the goal, is to reduce the number of abortions. And how is addressing issues of poverty, and how do we go about doing that? What does that look like?
Well, I think again, some anecdotes would be, as the Great Recession hit in 2008, 2009, Google searches of self-induced abortions just jumped.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And as I mentioned before, it affects men as well. As if you lose your job, or the specific study put forward by the American Economic Review and NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, by David Autor and others, cites when work disappears, manufacturing decline, and there's a falling marriage market value of young men. So,
wow.
When we talk about industrial policy or making the middle class, of bringing back middle class jobs that are pro labor, that are doable with people with a high school degree, right? Like, that's the kind of thing we really need to focus on. We should focus on housing policy, and because right now we think of our housing system as a whole as a reward for adult good behavior, but perhaps we should think of it as a public investment in the next generation of our children.
Right.
Because children grow up in houses and neighborhoods and public schools that are financed mostly by local property taxes, at least currently. So, Western Europe has the lowest, by global region, has the lowest abortion rate in the world. And they take care of their folks, right? I mean, there's a greater sense of we're in it together. We make investments in childcare. Maybe not the UK, but we think about the housing system as tied to the schooling system and the labor market, right? Because we want people to be able to take a job maybe in some other city without their home mortgage being underwater and they feel trapped.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of cross-national data, international data on this. And, I would just put that forward. There's lots of anecdotal evidence. I think there was one CEO who brought all, like he took a huge pay cut, and then was it Dan Stevens? I forget. But, gave every employee a raise to like $75,000 or $80,000.
Yeah, I remember that.
The people got married and they had kids.
Yeah. It's fascinating you mentioned Europe. I lived in Europe for 14 years. My pre-Stanford days, I was living in Vienna, Austria for 14 years. And I got a conversation once with the dad of an Austrian dad of one of the kids of my Little League baseball team. And we got into a discussion about it. He was a very successful businessman. We got into a discussion about economic policy and the differences between the U.S. and Europe and the whole social network and those kinds of things. And this is now we're talking early 1990s now, so 30 years, a long time ago. But he was saying, when our tax rates were close to 80%, I thought that was oppressive. Now our tax rates are in the neighborhood of 50%, and he says I'm okay with that. Because it helps. I have all the money I need, and it helps create an equitable system where my country feels safer and healthier and more equitable, and I'm okay with that. And as a young American at that time, it was those kinds of concepts were fairly new to me, and to have this guy, and I'm not advocating for any particular tax policy or anything like that. It just was interesting to hear that European perspective.
Yeah.
That there was value in the quality of his own life for everyone to have it a little bit better. And this guy was not a Christian. He was just your average Joe who had a successful business operation in Austria. And we had this interesting conversation. So anyway, I kind of experienced what you talked about a little bit about the European mindset when I lived there.
And I think the antitrust policies and corporate law policies can also play a big deal. I know when we talk about social economic programs, it raises yellow or even red flags for folks.
Yeah, exactly right.
But I would say, well, why not then create a tether between the CEO pay and the janitor pay, right? Right now it's called the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act, and why don't we make corporations by corporate law serve a productive social good, which is a little bit more wealth equality. I mean, it doesn't interfere with our incentive to work hard if people are worried about that. And then I think the big trust busting movement that started under the progressive Republicans in the early 20th century, carried on by the New Deal and then repudiated by Reagan, really needs to be brought back, because it's easier for huge monopolistic companies to ship jobs overseas. It's much harder for a smaller firm to do that.
Oh, interesting. Mako, go ahead. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because you mentioned this in a blog, I think, that you have on your website a little bit, about how tethering CEO pay to janitor pay or whatever. Elaborate on that so that someone who hasn't read your blog kind of understands that concept for a second.
Yes, I think currently in the U.S., the what's called the wage multiple of the CEO, the average CEO and the average median worker in that person's company has the CEO makes 450 times the median worker, right? And that's because of the inflation of the CEO role, stock buybacks, the ways in which we've eviscerated labor unions, right? So the workers have less power and bargaining power. So what the UAW has done is a great example of trying to reset that. Now, if we want to think about it that's from a labor union perspective. When we think about it from maybe a corporate and law or even corporate tax law policy, there is something called the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act, which says, if corporations are going to allow for things like this, then we're going to tax them at a higher rate because they're causing a problem. Walmart causes a problem when, the Walton family members make so much at the top, but then look at their, entry-level workers. Not only do they get injured at the job, at super high rates. I mean, I think only Amazon surpasses that. But
Mm.
they hire people in such a way that they have to go on disability, so they're also on federal welfare. So why are we subsidizing Walmart in this way?
Okay.
Other countries perceive the shared risk between the CEO and the average worker much more. And so in countries like Switzerland, Japan, there's a much a smaller wage multiple between the CEO and the janitor. In the U.S., it's a cultural misperception, I think, that we say, well, the CEO is going to move, so they're taking on risk. He has to move his family, find new schools for his kids and that kind of thing. Look, I mean, workers are also taking on risk by staying in the communities that they care about,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to find work and better their communities where they are, maybe even where they grew up. And so I think that we should recognize that in corporate law or corporate tax law.
So let me see if I can spit this back to you and make sure that I understand what you're saying. I think I got it. And that is, what you're saying is, when Amazon's CEO and Jeff Bezos and them make so much money, but then they underpay their employees are now on food stamps. Their employees are now on other types of welfare programs. And all that's a burden on the rest of society. So ultimately, the rest of society is subsidizing the fact that Amazon's underpaying their employees. We're paying that bill.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in addition to that, it's fair that we tether the CEO to the lowest paid worker, because in some industries like Amazon, I mean, who designed the personal computer? The Department of Defense, which was funded by who? Us, the taxpayers. How did we develop the internet? Well, it was ARPANET, which was developed by the Department of Defense, which was funded by us. Who paid for all the roads, right, that the Amazon delivery trucks run on? In other words, there's all this freeloading. And
so they made a profit by using things that we create. Oh, interesting.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Okay.
Wonderful. No, yeah. I think it was kind of the complexities of that, and sometimes get a lot. In the average flow of we don't think about those things very much. The connectivity of infrastructure and development that comes at other places that people are able then to exploit, not just because they can, not because they're evil so much, as just the way the system works.
Yeah.
That they can then opportunistically latch onto that stuff and then build their own empires out of that. So it's kind of it's fascinating.
Interesting. Interesting. All right. So Mako, let's change the conversation. Oh, did you want to add something to that?
No. Let's dive it back into abortion and that.
Okay. All right. So one of the arguments, obviously, that I was raised in, growing up in a traditional kind of conservative evangelical church or whatever, is that the embryo or the fetus, the zygote, or whatever stage of development it's at, is a human being. And one of my, I always used to say when I was young that one of my top 10 books of all time was Francis Beckwith's Politically Correct Death. And he argues that genetically, all the information is present at conception. Everything that you're going to be, and physically, in every sense of the imagination, was there at the moment of conception. But you're arguing in your book now that it's more simple, it's more complex than simple genetics. Can you kind of explain what you're talking about there, and the idea of quickening that I don't think a lot of us Protestants are familiar with, and explain your argument there?
Absolutely. It rests on a distinction between human life and human personhood. Okay. And if we think about end of life issues first, and then come back to beginning of life issues, and end of life care, beginning of life care, I think that will help make it make sense. If I lose a hand, there's no question that I'm still a human being and a human person, legally, intellectually, medically. But if I lose my brain functioning or nervous system, there would be real questions about what I would be. And when there is no more brain activity that registers on the scans, you could keep my heart pumping, you could keep my kidneys working, but legally and medically, I'd be dead. That is death.
And we consider it morally acceptable to pull the plug, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the question is not, okay, what's the genetic content of my body? Is it the same as every other human being, or in the same category? It's not. It's what's going on with my personhood, and what responsibilities, if any, do other people have towards me, like my family or society or the hospital. So think about that I think about that in terms of beginning of life care. Now, it is more complex, both in scripture and in science. And do you want me to talk about scripture first
Sure,
and then
please.
science?
Either one.
Great. So it's more complex because there is a number of passages, and I know that there are folks who just leap to Psalm 139. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Well, yes, but there's still this formed, unformed distinction, even in Psalm 139,
Oh, that's
which
true.
comes back to actually be present in the Greek Septuagint version of Exodus 21. Is the fetus formed or unformed if the mother is struck by someone, in a fight, and they force a miscarriage? Now, let me back up a little bit. The Greek Septuagint is one of the translations of the Hebrew original Old Testament that was formed before, that was written before Jesus. The Sanhedrin seems to have approved of it, and
that's the Jewish Supreme Court at the time of Jesus, the Sanhedrin.
Yes.
Sorry, yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and so they approved this translation along with Aramaic translations that were used in the synagogues along with the Hebrew text, because the kids don't speak Hebrew anymore,
That's
right?
right.
Like
Yeah.
so the rabbis do. So we want to come up with standard kind of language and interpretations of how to translate this into Greek and Aramaic. So the Hebrew version of Exodus 21 says, basically, if the fetus is not considered a fully human person until birth and breath.
Okay.
Now, I know there is a different school of thought about how to translate that. I deal with that in my blog.
You do.
It's a weak argument. John Calvin was the first to come up with it, and the Puritans who settled in North America rejected John Calvin's argument, and
Interesting.
and so it was not passed into the understanding at the time of the U.S. Constitution. And so regardless of whether you think John Calvin has anything worthwhile to say, and I don't think his argument holds any weight, it is that the ancient Jewish position on the fetus is birth and breath constitute full personhood. There's a gradual process. Many rabbis today believe there's 4 stages leading up to birth and breath and full personhood. And that raises questions then about the First Amendment, freedom of religious conscience issues for the Jewish community. The majority Jewish community holds this. Now, so that right away is really important. Also, Numbers chapter 5 is a situation where there's a husband who suspects his wife of having an affair, and so they both go to the temple, and she has to drink this water. And if she has had an affair, her belly gets bloated, and if she was pregnant, she has an abortion. So the husband in that case can initiate an abortion, and God performs it. That is really significant. And so the majority Jewish view is that abortion is never desirable, but there are moral considerations like legitimate parentage that enter in. And the state of Israel reflects that in their health policies and their abortion policies in different ways. But coming back then to these 2 texts, Numbers 5, Exodus 21, it is so important that to recognize, especially in Exodus 21, when there is a forced miscarriage situation, birth and breath for the Hebrew Masoretic. And then the Greek Septuagint says, basically, look at the miscarriage, see how formed it is. And if it is formed enough and it looks like a human being, that it can be said to bear the image of God. That's really important, because ancient Jews and early Christians said you're made in the image of God if you have a fully formed human body. That's it refers to our embodiment, because the way God appeared in the garden was in a human form. So I know that's really different than, let's say, the Alabama Supreme Court reasoning on IVF, which said, like, image of God from the moment of conception. No, that's actually not what, let's say, Irenaeus of Lyon said about in the 2nd century about what it means to be made in the image of God. It's not what this Greek Septuagint text says about what it means to be made in the image of God. It means to look human. And so
Mm.
the Greek Septuagint approach to the fetus is to say body and build. That is more morally discerning than the Hebrew Masoretic. And so we can discuss, I mean, it's very worthwhile to try to appreciate what happened there. How can it do that? And how can you be a Jewish community and operate with both translations at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
But this is really huge. In neither manuscript would we be able to conclude that conception is the place where we start human personhood.
Interesting. Interesting.
One of the pushbacks I would have, I mean, I think this is fascinating. And by the way, for those, we mentioned his book earlier, he goes into great detail on these texts in the book. And so you can get further information. I'm sure he's got blogs on the same thing. So there's ways to get more information on this if you want to pursue it. How about one of the pushback? I've actually had this argument because I was so thrilled when I read your book. I go, finally, someone is addressing the question I've had for years, and that is, and to use the theological term of ensoulment. When is the point that ensoulment takes place? When God puts, he created Adam, and then he breathed a breath of life in him, and he became a living soul. At what point after reading all this kind of stuff and thinking about it, the answer is we don't actually know for sure.
That's right.
We're speculating around this issue. Is it not then prudent, though, to assume it's as early as possible so that we don't get it wrong? I'm just curious how you think about that. So in other words, if we don't know for sure when ensoulment takes place, would we err on the side of caution and to push that our protection for that personhood as early as possible or as prudent?
Great question, Danny. And that is what the Catholics believed in 1869 when they changed their view from the roughly halfway through the pregnancy when mom feels the baby kick.
Right.
They thought that was the moment of ensoulment. They called it quickening because from Thomas Aquinas especially, they associated movement with life. Like those two things are connected. And so when mom feels the baby move, the fetus move, then we'll consider that to be ensouled. It's a subjective judgment, but look, that's the best folks could probably have ever done prior to more medical technology, because when it comes to abortion, the way Exodus 21 is phrased is when a forced miscarriage happens, when a woman suffers that, but that's an after the fact thing. If we wanted to then ask the different question and say, well, why don't we have precautions? What's going on with the fetus before a miscarriage? Then we have to consult science. Now, my argument there is it's dangerous to then make a maximalist argument from the argument of moral probability. Like, well, there's some probability that the fetus is ensouled from the first moment of conception because of what we've learned from embryology since then. So what we've learned is that the zygote becomes 4 totipotent cells. One of those cells, they look identical. They somehow know what to do, and one of those cells is going to become the placenta.
Right.
Now, we don't typically say that the placenta contains some of the human soul.
Okay.
We also have a problem of twinning and recombining, which from the standpoint of standard historic Christian categories of how the soul is the principle of individuality, we would have a problem. Because if you have one soul in a zygote that then twins, then that's a logical problem. If those twins recombine in what is called chimerism, then we have another problem. And that's when one person has 2 sets of DNA, right? Like you can contain the DNA of we assume your dead twin, but then we're already, the way we're talking about that is to presume that one of the twins died and then their genetic material was reabsorbed. Now, and that causes things like, different eye color. It's fascinating, but it happens with some frequency. And so to say that ensoulment must happen from conception has a lot of problems. in the book I talk about pluripotent cells. That's the next step, where
Right.
cells develop according to their relational context, which that's fascinating. And then they can be coaxed to reverse, and then they can become something else if you put them in a different context. That's fascinating from a scientific point of view, troubling from an abortion ethics point of view.
Right.
Because again, what, if those cells can become the whole embryo or just a pancreas, can a soul be trapped in a pancreas? Right. I mean, there's weird things that we would have to do. And then there's other issues, let's say anencephaly, which is when a fetus it develops and does not have a brain or an intact nervous system, and typically, and sometimes not even a skull. And so would we call that a human person? Well, typically not. And so what does that tell us? It suggests something like this. I mean, crudely, it means that the soul is not, let's say, equally distributed throughout the body, because it might be concentrated in the brain and nervous system, which need to be healthy, right? I mean, if somehow I was in the womb and I did not have a finger, there's, again, no question, I'm still a human life and a human person. A fetus without a brain is a human life. Is that a human person? I don't think so. And so I think that there's a way in which there are 2 markers at the 23-day mark. That's when the fetus has for sure implanted, any twinning and recombination has passed, and that's when a brain and nervous system is semi-detectable, like it's formed, or it's forming. And then at the 40 to 43-day mark, that's when brain activity is detectable in the fetus. And so if we are using at least some consideration of like, hey, beginning of life care and end of life care probably should look somewhat alike as best we can tell, then I think that would be the safest time to assign human personhood to a fetus and say, this is one moral consideration among others.
Yeah. Okay.
What specifically would be that time to consider moral personhood? Then it would be at 23 days or sometime later than that.
Well, I would feel most comfortable with the detection of brain waves in the fetus, right? 40 to 43 days, whatever that is. And I think,
and for those of us doing the math in our heads, that's still relatively early in the pregnancy. Now you're talking like 6 weeks.
7 weeks, yeah. Most women are just figuring out that they're pregnant at this point in time.
Yeah.
That is true. And I'm not saying that creates the slam dunk argument then to ban abortion at every point afterwards. I think there are other considerations, but or I'm open to other considerations. They're very hard to sort out, but all I'm saying here is this is part of the pro-contraception argument.
Got it.
Okay.
Because there are Christians or other conservatives who say, well, I'm against IUDs, I'm against the morning after pill because they could cause an abortion. They could cause a fertilized egg to not implant in the mother's uterus. And so the way they've defined that is to say that's an abortion. I disagree. And that's significant because even more important than economic welfare is contraception. If we wanted to drive down the abortion rate, then let's provide all forms of contraception to women, because this consideration of, early but not at conception makes room for all the forms of contraception. And IUD studies, especially among poor women, have been shown to be really effective at bringing down the rate of unintended pregnancies and therefore abortions. My concern is that some Christians and some conservatives are basically making the problem worse because they have a narrow understanding about this moral probability argument. They think it's for sure that ensoulment happens at conception. And I think the argument for that is weak. I think we should not speak of moral probability. We should speak of moral improbability.
Interesting.
Interesting. Wow. All right. Now, Mako, one of the things that's interesting here in reading your book, and obviously you have a series of live streams on your YouTube channel. They're on your anastasiscenter.org website as well. There are hundreds of articles, hundreds of links,
Yes.
and I'm not exaggerating. It is a massive plethora of great, wonderful information there. I encourage everyone to go to it as well. But one of the things that's interesting, then, so you point out that the biblical text isn't as clear as people have let it out to, at least as conservatives have let it out to be. When you made the comment about the Jewish interpretation, the validity of that is the fact that this is a Jewish text. It's a Hebrew text. And so we need to go, how do the Hebrews and Jewish readers understand it, not just how do the Christian readers understand it. Then you make the argument from early church history, and it's not as clear there, and a number of early church fathers advocating for what we might consider as abortion as well. But what's interesting then about evangelicalism is we think of evangelicalism as like solidifying around abortion, and I'm a one issue voter and all that good stuff. But what's interesting about evangelicalism is actually they didn't begin to embrace abortion as an issue until 1978. That's the first speech that we know of, if I'm not mistaken, with Falwell, when Roe versus Wade was in 73. In fact, we can actually find quotes from some of these leading evangelicals supporting abortion in Roe versus Wade, 73, 74, 75, 76 as well. So speak to that a little bit and help us understand the historical understanding of evangelicalism when it comes to the issue of abortion.
Right. I mean, evangelicals prior to 1978, 79, 80 said abortion is really, or the strong anti-abortion position is more Catholic than it is biblical, because they understood Exodus 21 and its ambiguities. So Carl Henry, Billy Graham said, I'm for all of the exceptions. The Southern Baptist Convention, all of the standard exceptions: rape, incest, health of the mother, life of the mother, maybe even mental health of the mother. So what changed was not that people suddenly became more biblically sophisticated. In fact, the opposite. It was that camera technology could suddenly photograph, the fetus in the womb, and then it just created this mass emotional appeal. And at least on the right, it was thought to be a response to the civil rights rhetoric of, hey, we're dealing with oppressed minorities here, and folks of color and discrimination, like racial discrimination, or women were discriminated against. I mean, women couldn't sign for a home mortgage until 1974, right? Own a credit card, except if their husband's name was on it. So there's all this discrimination happening. And the comeback of the right was, but what about the babies? And because they harnessed that perspective to a laissez-faire capitalist, let's dismantle regulation, let's dismantle the New Deal, then they were able to win Southern segregationists from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And that is under Nixon. That started under Nixon.
Yeah.
It was really powerful under Reagan. And to some degree, that's why the Democratic Party today wants to, I know this is broad generalizations, but wants to focus on economic issues. The Republican Party wants to focus on culture war issues. It's because there's the harnessing of anti-abortion into the anti-communist camp. So let's make it pro-capitalist, anti-New Deal. Let's make it part of our criminal justice system, as opposed to public welfare, framing and so forth. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's good.
Yeah.
Danny, you have anything on that you were thinking?
No,
of?
it's I'm a native Southerner, and the first church I ever pastored when I was way too young, in my 20s, was in rural Mississippi in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I actually helped count votes on that 1980 Reagan election. I actually helped count votes at a polling station in rural Mississippi in 1980 when I was 27 years old. So I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of the way the politics shifted in those eras. And so much stuff that was extraneous to Christian teaching was loaded into it as part of this package of this is what it of a block appeal and block voting for the Republican Party, particularly in the South. I kind of lived through that growing up, so I think you've painted a pretty accurate. There are other beyond the scope of this conversation. There are other parts of that are fascinating as well. I want to just, because we're going to run out of time here, and we can go on for hours here. Just really quickly, one of the things we picked up last week in our conversation with Jenna Jerfy. Again, if you have not listened to that, I encourage you to do that. Is that just the amount of trauma that women go through with pregnancies, even healthy pregnancies? It's a traumatic thing that we as men have little to no understanding of, obviously. And then the idea of criminalizing abortion. I know that there's some people out there say, well, let's only criminalize providers, et cetera. So two things I'm very curious about. The when we criminalize this, the lack of accountability for the men that are involved in this, and also the compounding of trauma on women. Could you comment at all on those very quickly?
Absolutely. So the trauma to women is huge, right? Even in a desired pregnancy, the fact of getting pregnant just causes huge hormonal shifts and life questions to be asked. Not only that, but 25% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. And then there are all kinds of health risks depending on a woman's personal health history, like heart conditions. She may be more susceptible to infections, preeclampsia, chorioamnionitis. That's when the amniotic fluid somehow develops an infection, uterine scarring from other issues. After my wife gave birth by C-section twice to our two kids, we were done. Like, that's enough, because there are certain health risks that she had about blood clotting and things. So, and this is where retributive Christian nationalism is so important to critique, because there is this pro-family rhetoric, but it's as if like every woman should become a mother or be open to becoming a mother with every act of sex, or just be open to having as many children as she can. That's the quiverful movement. Right. This is all part of white evangelicalism, and it's outrageous. The president of the Heritage Foundation, who authored Project 2025, holds to this view, and it has no regard for the fact that like these are huge health risks, not to mention, let's say, Black maternal mortality rates because of other issues of nutrition and stress and trauma in their lives, or they want to nuance the conversation so that you could distinguish between a miscarriage, an accidental miscarriage, and an abortion. But curettage is something that is a scraping of the uterus after a miscarriage or an abortion, and it's the same procedure. So, medically speaking, that matters for a woman's health for the next time this is relevant. And so the distinction of her intention is meaningless. So I don't understand. I mean, I understand, I think, why Project 2025, let's say, is saying things like this, but I totally disagree with putting even more of a burden on women, because already there's health risks. And if she chooses to get an abortion, there's risks there. There's risks then to the next time she wants to become pregnant. There's emotional costs. So what I would be in favor of is making abortion legal for the mother, legal for the abortion provider, and illegal for the father, and punishable with a fine. Now, I know that is unheard of. I don't hear very many people talking about things like that.
What do you mean by illegal for the father? How would that work?
Well, we can do DNA testing on every single aborted fetus, and we just keep the DNA match, and that proves something. We already do that for cases of rape when we need to figure out who's the father. So And what I mean by set up a fine is, well, I mean, Exodus 21 has a fine in place
right.
for a forced miscarriage. Well, you know, what if we were to actually, now I'm not saying we just read scripture like that straight off the page and know how to apply it, but
Sure.
I'm saying scripture and church history actually give women certain systemic advantages over men when their gender is in is relevant to the situation. I know my book talks about that. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
probably
There you
can't
go.
go into it here, but and sometimes the moral benefit of the doubt. For example, you know, a rape accusation in Jewish law, a woman's voice counts as 2 or 3 witnesses. Why is
Yeah.
that? Well, because of course she doesn't have witnesses to a rape. So, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
the issue is, yeah, sometimes a woman's gender is enough to say, let's put more responsibility, comparably speaking, on the man or on the father. And I think a fine is appropriate because, you know, and we could scale it to his income and wealth. I'd be fine with that, because there is a cost to doctors. There's a moral injury that they're incurring every single time this comes up, even if they perform an abortion, or if they do not, or if they choose, if they say, you know, I would like to serve in a rural area where there are now healthcare deserts, but I can't because I'm afraid of losing my license. That is a type of moral injury too, because they want to serve people. This is the problem, right? Like, so I think someone needs to bear a fine or a cost representing some accountability for it. And I think it should be the father. We currently say that women not only bear the bodily cost of pregnancy and miscarriage and abortion, but also the bodily cost, the cost to herself relationally for discerning, is a man ready to be a father and a husband?
Yeah.
Well, all I'm saying is, let's shift the burden of that part. Let's put it on the man. What if a man gets a woman pregnant and wants to keep the baby, but she doesn't, then he's wrong, because he trusted the wrong woman. He made the wrong judgment. It was, or it's not the right time for them, and it was his responsibility to know that.
Mako, we could go on for a few hours. I'm sure we could. I kind of was thinking, you kind of remind me of myself when someone brings up the topic of the book of Revelation. I could just keep going and going and going and going. I want to thank you so much for your work. I want to recommend it strongly, the AnastasisCenter.org, all the resources there, the live streams that you have, or the webinars that you've done there, the articles you have on there. You don't have to buy the book per se, which is up on the top screen, corner of the screen, but the articles, resources there to kind of get started and see if you want to go get the book as well. This is great. Maybe we can have you back for another conversation in the future as well. But yeah, go ahead, Danny, really quickly.
I was going to say, I just want to remind anyone watching or listening to this, our goal is not to say you have to agree with us. Our goal in this whole series is to ask you to think.
Amen.
Ask you to consider prayerfully. You can disagree with us 100% and be 180 degrees on some of these issues with us. We're as followers of Jesus trying to flesh out what does it mean to be kingdom people in this world that we live. Amen. And these issues are complicated and they have multiple, they're multifaceted. They have all kinds of consequences that we need to consider. And we just want you to take time to think about these things and not just accept some generalized policy or approach that doesn't consider the complexities of these issues. So just want to put that caveat in there because I think it's important for people to remember that.
Exactly. And that's why we named this ministry Determine Truth. Our goal is to determine what the truth is. Then we have the hard work of actually following it and doing what it says. And again, we provide all these live streams, the blogs, the podcasts, everything free of charge. We're never going to hide anything behind a paywall. We refuse to do that. So if you will kindly feel free to support us, that'd be wonderful. You can go to determinetruth.com. There's a give tab there. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We have upcoming live streams. Mako might be interested. We have one coming up in 2 weeks on the business of war, and that's going to be a phenomenal conversation talking about war and why are we fighting these wars. We have one next week on Israel and Gaza, where Dr. Gary Burge and I are going to have a conversation just saying what's going on here. We're 10.5 months into this war on Gaza, so we have plenty more coming up. The Thursday night series on the gospel of the kingdom and the poor. There's an interview with May Cannon tomorrow, and the Christian Forum in Israel Palestine, which Determined Truth is loosely related to as well. So all that's on the website. I want to thank Mako for being with us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rob and Danny, for your
great having you here.
friendship and partnership.
Yeah.
All right.